Okay, today we're going to be talking about decolonization, and I want us to first take a look at that word and figure out, like, what does decolonization mean? Obviously, I hope it's familiar. The idea that colonization is the process of making colonies or establishing colonies, and decolonization would be the undoing of decolonization. But I also want us to think about this in the context of what's going on in the Cold War, because when we're learning about this, we are in the midst of the Cold War. The events we're going to learn about with decolonization start in the 1940s and take us through the early 1990s. And so it really is all done in the context of the Cold War. So please be aware of that as we go through these next few topics. So decolonization, we have to start with imperialism, which should be good review for you guys before your final. We know that European imperialist nations owned almost all of Africa, all of Asia, and a big part of the Middle East all after World War I. This is going to allow them a lot of economic advantages where they gain access to raw materials and natural resources and cheap labor and new markets and all of that stuff. And it's going to kind of prohibit those nations from ever really developing. Because those nations were never able to fully develop, since they were constantly under European control, we're going to start to see a rise of changes after World War II. Also, it's important to pay attention to there wasn't just official colonies or land or territory that was under direct control from the Europeans in Europe and in Africa and Asia, but there were also spheres of influence in Latin America and China. So just like the Soviet Union had spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, Britain, France, Germany, they had spheres of influence in Latin America and in so, for example, the United States had great influence over Cuba. So, even though they weren't officially our colony, in 1898 we helped them win their independence, and most of the businesses owned in Cuba were American owned. Additionally, if you look at this map, you're going to see that a lot of different European countries have control or influence over different parts of China, and they're going to take economic control there and take advantage of them. So while China and Cuba are going to have their own governments, their economies are really going to be dominated by these imperialist westernized nations. So stop and pause, and I want you to actually answer these two questions in your notes. One, what is the difference between a colony and a sphere of influence? And two, what benefits did the Western imperialist nations get from their colonies and spheres of influence? So by the time World War II ended, there's a rise in anti-colonial and nationalist movements throughout these African and Asian and Latin American colonies. During World War II, European nations lost a lot of power. They came out of the end of it a lot weaker. Japan, Europe, they lost control of a lot of their colonies. And so that's going to lead to even more independence movements in the colonies. And maintaining control of those colonies is going to be way too expensive for the Europeans and the Japanese. And so a lot of them just willingly give them up. Also, in the midst of World War II, something called the Atlantic Charter was an agreement that FDR from the United States and Churchill from England agreed to. It's the pledge that they would not take any more territory after World War II. It said that they believe that all people have this right to self-determination, and they should be able to decide for themselves what their government should be, which that would kind of contradict with imperialism and colonization, wouldn't it? So at the end of the war, the United States actually grants the Philippines their independence in 1946, actually on July 4th, so that's kind of symbolic. But they don't give up all of their colonies, which I think is kind of interesting. And they assumed that these new nations that would be newly independent would be democratic and allow Western businesses in, but that's not always going to be the case. So here's just a map showing you some of those new nations that are developed between 1946 and 1991, incidentally the same years of the Cold War. So you see a lot of them are in Africa, but we also see former British territories in India and what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, and French colonies in French Indochina, what is Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam today. So stop and answer these three questions now. How did World War II affect the power of Western imperialist nations? What does self-determination mean? And how did the principles of the Atlantic Charter conflict with imperialism? So make sure you go ahead and pause and give yourself a second to answer those questions. Okay, hopefully you answered those questions. So now let's talk about decolonization. Of course, decolonization is just formal definition. It's the end of foreign domination and the formation of new independent nations. So new countries are being made, right? And this generally happened in three ways. The first way is that colonies won their freedom without serious violence. So when countries like the US and Britain say, hey, we are willingly going to give up our colonies, like the Atlantic Charter kind of alluded to. So in India, this happened sort of this way. They weren't fully granted their independence. There were a lot of series of conflicts and clashes along the way, but ultimately they didn't have to fight a war to win their independence like, the Americans did against the British in the American Revolution. So India, Nigeria, Uganda, a lot of British colonies actually gained their independence this way. The second way is that white settlers who had been living in that territory for a very long time, in that colony for a long time, started to fight back against those nationalist movements. And we are definitely going to see that in South Africa, as well as Kenya, Algeria, and Zimbabwe. And then the third way that this is going to happen is that nationalist movements would actually follow Marxism or communism. And they would want to change their entire economy and society based around socialism. So they're essentially rejecting every aspect of Western society and Western culture because of the influence. It's almost like a kid who leaves mom and dad's house and does everything exactly the opposite of what mom and dad would want them to do, just to stick it to them. And we're going to see that for sure in China and Cuba. So take a moment and pause and think back to that last slide. What does decolonization mean? And which of the three ways would Western nations most likely prefer? So when we put decolonization in the context of the Cold War, we know that the Cold War is the United States versus the Soviet Union, and both the United States and the Soviet Union want to influence the newly independent nations, and that means influencing their government style, their economic system, and most importantly, how much access the United States and the Soviet Union will have to the resources and raw materials in those places. Because let's not forget, that's the reason they went and took over Africa and Asia and Latin America in the first place. So both superpowers start giving aid, military aid and economic aid, to these newly formed countries. And so we're going to see the USSR give money and support to a lot of Asian and African nations. And the US is going to encourage Britain to grant independence to their African colonies. And nationalist and communist movements are going to be aided by both sides, by the West and by the East. And this is going to be another issue between the US and the Soviet Union, is who's going to have the most influence in these newly formed countries. So stop and pause. What did both the US and the USSR want from the new nations, and what did they want that was different? Okay, and last I want to leave you with this map. So growing up, we talked about like first world countries, second world countries, and third world countries. And essentially, we broke it down into what is blue, pink, and green on this map. So we have which nations are in part of the first world, mostly those westernized nations, the United States, Western Europe, the ones that are part of NATO. And we see that in the second world, we have in the pink there more of the communist nations. And then the third world. Where do we see the third world but in places that are former colonies? And so this is obviously a very Eurocentric, a Western European-centric attitude that the first is the best, and that is the democratic and capitalistic way. Not so much is the Soviet and communist way. And the third is like, oh, you're still like white man's burden, you still need our help. And that third developing, decolonized area of the world. So now I have a couple of questions for you. One, In which of the three worlds were most of the imperialist nations, or the colonizers, the people who actually were doing the conquering? And which of the three worlds were the colonies? And then I want you to look and see if you can see any trends, and I want to discuss this when we get back together, do you notice any geographic distinctions between these three worlds? Can we divide the globe into a west versus east and a north versus south and draw some logical conclusions from that? We will discuss that when we see each other again.